Fishing vessel grateful and Labrador Coast Guard, we are reading you loud and clear.
So welcome, Debbie. I'm really delighted to have you joining us on Seaview's podcast today and come up to the bridge to join myself and Adam Parnell from Chirp. So welcome, Debbie.
Thank you.
It's really interesting to have you with us because you work for an organisation called Port Skills and Safety. And so you really are in the area between ships coming in and the port and that interface. So I think this is going to be really interesting to talk to you about that role. Would you mind giving me a bit of an overview of what your job is and your organisation?
Yeah, of course. So Port Skills and Safety is a membership organisation, and like the advert, it very much does what it says on the tin. We look after safety and skills within the UK port sector. It sits somewhere between other trade associations in ports. So there's the British Ports Association and the UK Major Ports Group. And both of those have some similar members, but some different members. But they both wanted to make sure that they agreed on areas like safety and skills where there shouldn't be any competition. And it should be about what makes it better for one person makes it better for everybody. So really about sharing best innovation and making sure that there's good skills in ports and a good pipeline of skills coming through as well. So we're a membership organisation with approximately 120 members, and they range from the largest ports in the UK, international companies that have ports in the UK, port service providers, port stevedoring companies, port labour supply companies, training providers, but also increasingly innovation and digital tech companies where they've got ideas around technology that can improve ports. But getting kind of technology people to talk in port language is sometimes a bit of a barrier. I don't know if you've ever tried to speak to someone who's making apps. You have to speak one language, and then if you work in ports, you have to speak another language. So we bring those two worlds together, and particularly around where innovation improves safety or helps to take the port world to the outside world to make sure we get that pipeline of young people coming through.
That's a really good overview. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Debbie. I'm going to ask you this, obviously, because of my previous port background as a harbourmaster, but I'm really interested to know what you see as the main risks and issues in port safety.
It's always difficult to pinpoint a risk or a safety measure, because I think if you say this is where the riskiest thing is in ports, that's what everyone looks at, and then the difference comes up behind you. We do collect incident data around port accidents, and that will tend to tell us every time that slips, trips and falls are actually the biggest risk in ports. And it's interesting, you kind of think at some of the major operations that ports do and the kind of special one-off lists that they might do, you think that would be where the high risks are. And actually, and they are high-risk operations, but because they're high-risk operations, everybody's got that slightly higher level of awareness. It's that every day where we find that it's difficult to get that constant safety message going. So whilst, walking across a port isn't obviously the riskiest thing you can do as part of your job, that's actually where you are by the statistics likely to have an incident or an accident because you don't have that same level of awareness. But yeah, it's interesting, but it is generally the everyday thing where the incidents happen. I mean, we do obviously find that kind of container port containers are more of a risk than some of the other types of activities, port operations. The quayside has more incidents than some of the other areas in ports. But we don't like to say, this is where the risk is, because that's where everyone will look, and that's when you miss where the incidents really are. So it's about our main philosophy is to keep finding new ways of saying the health and safety message, to keep reminding people that every day everybody wants to go home safely. One of the areas that we do try and focus on is that interface, because I think it's easier for ports to talk to their own port people about that safety first message. But it's a bit harder when you look at the fact that ports have constantly either got something coming in or something going out. They are the interface in the middle. So it's about making sure that those people coming into the ports who don't have the port as their everyday workplace understand the risks that there are. And that's from seafarers coming and offloading, seafarers coming in to traverse the port, the public moving through the port, or hauliers coming in from the other end to travel through the port. So it's about making sure that everybody's aware every day that ports are a high-risk industry, and you have to be aware of what's going on. Because, when we talk about everybody going home safely at the end of the day, we don't just mean the high days and holidays. We mean every single day, everybody should be going home from their workplace safe and sound
No, that's a really insightful answer. And actually, you've hit on a good point there, which is that a lot of people look at what they consider to be a lower risk activity, like transiting a port, perhaps on foot, and their mental model of what constitute risks, because they're exposed to risk all the time. I see that sometimes people look at things that in any other scenario would be, oh, this is moderately risky. I'm walking along a quayside at low tide, so I'm effectively working at height. There's a sharp edge. There's lots of things to trip over. And yet in a port, that's almost the sort of baseline. So we forget that it's risky. I think that was a really good point. But you're right. I mean, I used to describe people when I was a harbour master as, and certainly to visitors, as imagine a port is like a construction site. Plus, it's got all the vehicles, all the plants, got all the contractors. There's things going on around you, things stacked up, the thing can fall on you, et cetera, et cetera. And then you throw on top of that all the hazards and risks that are particular to the maritime domain. So I think that was really, I liked your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think when you look at a construction site, you've typically got people that always work on a construction site on those sites. They might do different jobs, but they're used to being on a construction site. The construction site is their place of work. Whereas in ports, seafarers consider the ship to be their place of work. Hauliers can consider their cab to be their place of work. They don't consider necessarily the port to be their place of work. And I think I compare it sort of similarly when I used to work in the shipping side and sort of going onto the bridge and there'd be alarms going off and you think, oh my gosh, there's an alarm going off. Why, someone should be reacting. Why is no one reacting? So that's just this alarm or that alarm. And when this alarm goes off, then we'll worry, but those other alarms are fine. And it's about knowing which of those alarms are actual alarms and which of those alarms are just the routine activities that you're doing.
Yeah, no, we almost become risk blind. I'm heartened to hear that the Port Skills and Safety have an incident database and that you collect these reports, because that's really important. And obviously, as one reporting system to another, as it were, with my chirp hat on, is to me, capturing those lower level things, such as the slips, trips and falls, are actually the ways we can address the more serious issues that happen later on. So I'd really like to understand a little bit more about how you collect those reports, what you do with them, et cetera, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so our main kind of motto at PSS is it's all about collaboration. So it's about making sure that the lessons learned are learned once and learned by everybody. So there's a number of ways that we do that. And outside of kind of just collecting stats, we kind of share all safety alerts, share incidents and near-miss reporting and stuff like that. But the actual incident database we have kind of collects all statistics from near-misses, observations and incidents and accidents on the port. And then we use those primarily for benchmarking against each other, because I think although ports aren't always competitive with each other commercially, one port handles one sort of goods and another port will handle another sort of goods, they are competitive on a different level. We've got quite a healthy attitude now, I think, to risk, is that they all want to be shown to be the safest. The flip side of that, I think it goes back to the point earlier about where are the high risk areas. Gone are the days where ports had a sign up saying X number of days since our last accident, because what that typically does is stops people reporting near misses. And what we want to do is move to a place where reporting observations, reporting near misses is an everyday activity. So whilst we're benchmarking, it's not just benchmarking to say, I had no accidents and you did. It's to benchmark to say, we've done this number of observations, we've found this number of near misses, and to make sure that the pyramid is looking right. So that, there's the number of near misses that comes up is kind of typically a pyramid of a number of observations and near misses will result in one accident over time. So it's about making sure that we're observing all of those things and sharing the lessons on them. When there are near misses, sharing what could have happened, what did happen. And that's not necessarily a bad news story. Often this was a near miss because this intervention happened and that stopped it being an incident or accident. So other people can learn from those kind of interventions as well as just learning from the incidents that happened. So we use that dashboard at the moment for kind of benchmarking and looking at kind of benchmarking year on year and benchmarking similar ports against each other. But we're moving more into the territory now of getting large amounts of data sets to look at the underlying root causes. And I think that's somewhere where AI and computer learning has really started to come into ports. And we've been talking about data for quite a long time in ports. Data is king has kind of been a bit of a motto for a few years now. But I don't think anybody really quite understood why. We all knew that it was important to record data and to gather data, but no one really quite understood what it was going to do. Was it going to just do, like we said earlier, pinpoint, this is where the risk is, this is where you should focus on. But we're starting to learn that with AI and computer learning, the more data you can put in, the better analysis that will come out of it. And that doesn't say that it takes over from humans, it doesn't replace human beings, it supports them by saying, here are some underlying causes that of all of these random things that you've put in, here are some root causes that are common themes throughout all of them. And it's things that if you were to do it as a human, to analyse all that kind of different information would take years and years, whereas computers can do that kind of instantly. So it's about saying all of these near misses in all of these areas, all of these incident data, here's some underlying root causes that you need to look at, and kind of reinforces ideas about where, you know, we know what it's like. You kind of say, I feel like something's happening in this area, but I can't quite put my finger on it. The AI can look at those statistics and say, oh yeah, there's an issue here around communication or operations that you need to address. So, and it's then for the human interaction to address that issue, but the AI just uses the time to look at that massive amount of data that we might have missed. So that's kind of the next step for us, is getting all that root cause, incident investigations together to find out kind of where those commonalities of root causes are.
Oh, that's really interesting and great use of technology. And actually, I think AI, as you say, won't replace people, but it will certainly be really good at detecting patterns and drawing attention of the analysts to those areas. Certainly, that's how we're looking at it.
Yeah, and what we found going on from that is, when we've been talking for a long time about kind of data, what the AI analysis has showed us is that we're not always collecting the right data. So it's making sure that now going forward, we know why we're collecting the data, and we know actually what data we need to collect, in what way we need to collect it. And that doesn't mean being prescriptive about giving people a tick box in observation, say, you know, you must get it into one of these categories. It's using natural language processing, but it's saying everything that you get, if you write it down in some form, the computers can analyse it and bring that together. But to make sure, you know, instead of just writing Joe Bloggs cut his finger on a bit of cardboard, you're actually putting a bit more thought into where that happened, why it happened, so that the analytics can come out of it. Because I think too often, people file these kind of incident reports and it goes into the ether and they never hear of it again. Whereas by using this process, you can reassure people that everything they write is being used and is affecting that whole bigger amount of information and data that the computers can use to feed back some interesting analysis.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's great to hear that. But I wanted to go back to a point you made slightly earlier about getting ports to report. That's really heartening, because one of the big hindrances to getting that data that, as you say, is really important, is we find many companies really want to hide their bad news, as they see it, behind the company firewall. They don't want anybody to know about it. And I always say to people, there's a real paradox here, because everybody in the maritime industry acknowledges that the maritime industry is one of the more dangerous professions. And yet we're all putting up this facade of nothing to see here, we're 100% of the time. And both those statements can't be true, right? So, and I think that really stymies learning. So actually hearing that you're collecting this data, that people are giving it to you, that's really heartening, because it sounds like you've broken down those stovepipes.
Yeah, I think we have really seen a step change in attitude in the last couple of years. I think, kind of, if you look at the fatality rates 6 or 7 years ago, they were really quite high. And the ports themselves realised that something had to happen, and something had to, a line had to be drawn in the sand, and something had to change. And I think they all realised that the only way it was really going to change was by sharing what's happened and being more open and honest. And that's not to say that everybody's doing it, but I think we certainly got some ports leading by the front. And I think if we can get those bigger companies to do it as well, then that kind of leads the smaller ports to it. I think the difficulty nowadays actually is less about willingness, and it's more just about resources, of having the people to be able to do those investigations, to get all that information down, to be able to say about it, rather than an unwillingness to share. So when we host our meet, and there is still the kind of the HSE in the room, as we call it. There's still we don't want to reveal too much to the authorities. We don't want to get ourselves into trouble, which is why we're kind of quite protective about what we're doing for members. And it's very much about members sharing with each other and being open and honest with each other for the benefit of all of them. And I do think we've definitely seen a step change in that attitude. There's still quite an ongoing argument about whether safety first is really the key. And is that realistic? Is it safety first, or actually is it your company being a going concern is first, and safety is one of the ways that you do that? But it's definitely about having a much better and open, honest attitude, and that definitely comes from the top. And I think we've seen a step change from the top that says we cannot keep having these fatalities particularly. And I think anyone who's ever had to deal with a fatality at work knows that it doesn't just affect that person's family, it affects the entire organisation. both financially and, on the culture on the ground. People have a different attitude to work when, one of their mates basically has been lost. It changes people's attitudes. So it's about making sure that we can make those changes to the attitudes and behaviours before anything happens.
Yeah, that's, again, you've raised some amazing points there. So the first one that you touched on was that fear of enforcement. And I think that's a really powerful disincentive, which is why, organizations and charities such as ourselves, such as Port Skills and Safety, that's why we exist, because we have moral authority, if you like, but what we don't have is executive authority. So people can come to people like PSS and not fear that you're going to shut them down. Obviously, when it becomes a statutory reporting issue, then obviously it has to be going down those routes. But getting people to just have those safety discussions about things and learn lessons and actually share best practice. I mean, that's what we're all trying to achieve here, aren't we? Without sounding too cynical, I think you're right. Everybody says we put safety first, but I think the rest of that sentence is we put safety first, comma, after we've actually made sure that we are a reputable, sustainable, credible business.
Yeah, we always say, if you want to make ports safer, take the people away.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if you have no people, you have no people getting hurt. But in reality, that's not how you want to run your business. It has to be in the best interest of your employees, and your employees want your business to succeed. And actually, just from a purely financial standpoint, a safer company is a cheaper company to run.
Yeah,
because you're not having to deal with, the retrospective action that you have to take. So you're much better off being upfront with it. And I think that incentive point that you made earlier is an interesting one as well. We've gone from the days of, incentivizing people not to report to kind of wondering how you can incentivize people to report now, how you can make it clear. And that's much harder to do, because to incentivize people not to report, you can just have the 20 days without incident marker on the wall. But to incentivize people to report, the only way to do that is through trust. And that takes a lot longer to build and seconds to destroy. So it's about making sure that we're constantly talking about, safe reporting and no blame cultures. The things that other sectors have already learned. We're not at the forefront of this. Other sectors have learned how to have no blame reporting and how to make the industry safe for everybody. And it's, ports are kind of coming up from behind in some respects.
Yeah, no, that's true. And point that you made about everybody being affected by an incident or an accident. Actually, there was a piece of research I constantly refer to. There's a chap called Robin Dunbar in the 80s. He calculated that on average, every human knows about 150 people. And of course, that was before social media took off. And he had a great working definition, which I loved. He counted you as knowing someone if you could walk into a pub uninvited, see them drinking at a bar and feel you could go up and have a drink with them without having been explicitly invited to join them. And I love that as a working definition. As an ex-seafarer, I can relate to that. But, 150 people minimum that will know that person that got hurt or injured. And actually, I think from a just company morale point of view, if you're running a company and people are getting hurt, what's that doing to the rest of your workforce? So, no, absolutely right.
A lot of times it's the people at the top that are having to speak to the families about it, and they don't want to have to do that more than once. I think once you've had to go and tell someone's family that they've lost their child or they've lost their husband or father or brother, you don't want to have to do that again.
No, you're absolutely right. And I can relate to that. I'm going to hand over to Julia now because I feel like I'm dominating this conversation a bit.
No, it's really interesting. I'm just listening to the discussion about the data, because lots of industries collect data, but it's so interesting to actually see how you're going to analyze it. And you're talking about the data that you get now, or that you're getting in at the moment. Does it give you the insight into who's most at risk? Is it these seafarers who, if you like, are your visitors to the port, or is it the port workers? Can you tell that which kind of profession is at most risk, as it were?
So the data that we collect comes from the port companies, and I think this is actually highlights one of the problems. A lot of organisations like PSS collect data on incidents, and we don't share it broadly across the sector. So there's people that collect statistics about incidents particularly related to seafarers. There's organisations that collect pilot ladder incidents, for example. And one of the things that PSS has been calling on the government kind of to get involved in is to bring all those people together and say, actually, if you can learn lessons about incidents and near misses within ports and within seafaring, then if you bring all those things together, how many more lessons are there to learn? And I think we tend to avoid going down is it the seafarer or is it port operative that's most at risk? Because people know their own jobs and they know what they're doing. The problem comes in that interaction where you get, particularly if you had a ship that has never visited a port before with crew that have never visited that port before, they undertake that operation on that ship a lot, but they don't do it in that port. They don't do that operation on that ship, but they've done that operation in their port lots of times before. So it's about making sure that everybody knows the processes that are going to happen for that particular ship visit. And it's about not assuming that whatever you did the last port or the next port is going to be the same as you're doing in this port. And I think that's the main thing. And I think one of the things that we try and do with the lessons learned is one of the problems that we have in the UK is about that broader legislative incident investigation and whether the MCA, the MIB investigate or whether the HSE investigate. And this is, when we get to more serious incidents, because they base it on who that person reports to. So if a port operative is injured on a ship, it will be that person reports to the port and therefore the HSE will investigate it. If a incident happens to a seafarer in the port, they report to the master, so the MCA will investigate it. And we're saying actually it's about the interaction between those two places, and both sides need to learn all of those lessons about the interaction between the two. And certainly the MCA and the HSE are starting to understand that a bit better themselves as well now. But we want to make sure that there's always lessons for any incident for both those parties. So it's not about one being more inherently risky than the other, or one set of workers not being as health and safety conscious as another set of workers. It's purely about people understand their role, and it's about understanding better how your role fits in with everybody else's role. And we undertook a campaign at the end of last year looking at ship-to-port communications. And what we did was we looked at when a ship's coming into a port, all the different people's perspectives of what that day is going to entail. And the number of people that one person's got to communicate with and interact with to be able to get that work done highlights the difficulty in it. So it's not about that job. Everybody knows what that operation is, but they've got to work with lots of other people who have different cultures, different languages, different working policies and practices. So it's about making sure that, that you talk to the ship that's coming in before it arrives and understand how that operation on that particular day is going to work. And, especially, in maritime, we talk about, those operations, but then you've always got all those unknown factors to throw in, like, the weather and the time of day, the time of year, all of those factors that come in to make that operation different from the way it can be any other time that you've done it. So it's about making sure that you approach every operation as a new one, as a new task with new risks, and not become complacent about those risks.
The point you made about bringing together different data sets, I'd like to pick up on, because actually I was at a conference, a fishing safety conference in Rome a few weeks ago, where the representatives of the UN's FAO, ILO and IMO were all basically saying this is something that needs to be done at an international level, that each sector within the maritime industry, if it does share lessons, will only really share them between it. And to that end, that's why when we publish our newsletters with safety reports, we try to almost anonymize the type of ship. Because if I say, on an oil tanker, I can guarantee everybody that doesn't work on an oil tanker will flip to the next one and miss the good learning. And that's actually perhaps the next stage, that data sharing cross-sector, cross-industry, internationally potentially, bring it all together. And, I hope technically it can be done. It could have been done years ago. I'm hoping, as you say, attitudes are changing. People will be able to do it more and more in the future.
I think the thing that makes the computers will make the difference to that, because we're not giving one person all that data and saying you go through it because then you can pick out who the people are. Once you put all of that data anonymized into a computer, the computer doesn't care who these people are or what they are or what they're doing. It strips out all of that information because that's not relevant to those learnings. It just, you put all the data in and it takes out the bits that it needs to know in order to find those commonalities and those root causes. So I'm hoping, as we get more comfortable with AI, and I think that again is the inherent problem with AI, is that people are quite scared of what it could do, scared of the whole kind of taking over, replacing people thing. But as long as we understand where we can make good use of it, and data analysis is where we can make the best use of it to say, right, it can do this in a much faster, much more comprehensive way than an individual can do. Let's bring all those data sets together and see what the computers can make of them. And it takes time to teach the systems. The system that we're just piloting at the moment to look at root causes, we've had to do a lot of kind of training of the computers to understand that when we talk about a tug, we might be talking about a tug in a port that's taking a container, or we might be talking about a tug on the water and things like that. What we mean by things to help it to understand. But once we can get that understanding, the outcomes are always going to be exponentially better.
Do you know, I completely get that. And the reason I'm smiling is because I had our database analysed about 18 months ago to go through. And I said, look, we've got a lot of data. I'd really love to look for patterns. What insights can you give me with this data that I've got? Which we gave it over to university, and this master's guy, he looked at it and he came through and he went, oh, really interesting. Alaska's the most dangerous place in your database. And I went, really? I said, I don't recall ever seeing a report. We get reports from all around the world, but I can't recall seeing one from Alaska, let alone many. He said, yeah, Anchorage. I went, the vessel was in Anchorage, not in Anchorage. But you're right. And
yeah, we've had similar things with left. Is it someone going left or has something been left? And all those sorts of things. Yeah, it just takes time to kind of go through them and help the computer to know what we're talking about. And even it's the same as if you're explaining to a person who's never worked in maritime what these terms mean. You have to take the same approach.
Yeah, and of course, we're looking very much at the English language, and there's just as much, if not much more, in other languages too, because I know English is the maritime language, but official language, but actually there is a lot of learning out there.
Yeah, when you're at sea, but again, if you're in port, it's going to be the port language. And again, that's the benefit of computers, is that, the language abilities of computers these days is so advanced that it doesn't matter. We managed to train a couple of the languages on colloquialisms as well, and stuff like that. It's all about understanding language, and that's what they can do.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I really wanted to go on to that because I think this naturally leads on to training, doesn't it? If you've got the insight, how is training sort of supporting safety in the port environment?
Well, we think from a very basic level, the safest ports are the ports with the best skilled, best trained people, because it's about the attitude every day. It's about those behaviours every day, and being trained to be able to undertake the job and to understand the risk is what makes it safer. So we've seen a lot of developments in training, and I think that there's good potential for digital coming up in training environment. I think ports, the same as the wider maritime, still suffers from that lack of potential of outside awareness in some respects. But I think for ports, a lot of ports have traditionally recruited from their local communities, but it tends to be father, son, friends at school, that kind of area. Whereas some people in some port live in a port town will not know what the port does. Ports have got quite secretive in a few years back. Obviously you have the kind of publicly owned ports where they've got public access ports, but then you've got the kind of likes of Felixstowe where within about 3 miles of Felixstowe you can't get any further. So how do you know what's going on behind those doors? So there's an awareness raising, I think, to bring in those new people, and I think we've got to move away a bit from the father recruiting son, friend recruiting friend, because you tend to pass on some of the bad habits that you've got if you're training people that you've known. And certainly if you get to be stereotypical, you can get kind of young lads racing forklift trucks around the port. So you need to kind of get that diversity of thought in to help kind of move away from this is the way we've done it because this is the way we do it because this is the way we've always done it. So to bring in diversity. But I think we can also use different methods of teaching people about ports now. And one of the things that Port Skills and Safety is just looking at is about gamification. And that's about taking the gaming systems that you use, kind of Call of Duty, those kind of first player, role player games, and putting that into a working environment. And it's called serious gaming. And so
Adam's not.
Yeah, I've got a 10-year-old. I can't get him off the PlayStation, let alone, I don't need to teach him about first-person shooters.
Yeah, it's about using that first-person gaming to show you around a port. So instead of just saying you're on a crane, you need to move the container from one place to another, it talks about when you're in the crane, you're looking around and are you spotting the safety hazards? Are you making sure that everybody around you is wearing the right PPE? How do you approach people that aren't wearing the right PPE? And so it brings all that technology together. It shows you all the way through the port. So you can take people through a port in a much better way than you could ever before because of that kind of security of getting into a port. So you can have a port that completely looks like your port, that you walk around, it's got all the warehousing that you've got, so you can teach people if they're going into the warehouse what that looks like, what the safety risks are. Even things like, you kind of look down, you see a pile of rubbish and you've got to act to put that rubbish in its proper place, so things like that. So it's something that is really useful, and the statistics show that it's a much better way for a lot of people to learn, young and old, because they're actually going through it and living a real life experiences. as opposed to just kind of sitting in a classroom kind of style, teaching people about it, or even showing pictures or videos of it, being able to kind of see it for yourself. And of course, it opens it out to being able to go to young people and say, in careers fairs and things like that, this is what a port looks like and this is what you can do. And I think the kind of knock on of that as well is when we look at things like working on height on cranes. If you work in a big container port, the crane is effectively taking boxes from one place and putting them to another place. So do you have to be at the top of a crane? Can you not put that person in a cabin on the ground, remove that working at height risk and let them operate that crane from ground level? As long as they've got that situational awareness of, and you can get kind of 360 awareness of those same sorts of things. So it's about how can we move that technology to not just be about training, but actually to make ports safer.
Yeah, so the technology is also coming in that you can actually see where it can be used to just take out some of that risk and remove it.
Yeah, it can certainly help to take away some of this. And again, it's not about removing people because you've got so many unknown variables in ports and in the wider maritime that it's difficult to see a world where you could just take people away from it. But it's about putting them in a safer environment. And it's also, you can also start using it for a lot of other applications. So for example, there's a Bristol Port Company have a simulator for their cranes. And they have the same chairs and the same things. And they've done some experiments on different times of day and what effect that has on your concentration. And so you can get people to run through moving their cranes the same as they're doing in their workplace, but you can test what the environment does to that work. And they've even kind of started to get people to go on a treadmill before they go onto the simulator, so you can see what difference having to climb up that tower, the impact that's having and stuff like that. And so it's got a lot of good applications. And I think one of the things that came out of that as well is that they were finding that when new people were going onto the cranes, the first thing they want to do is have a look around and spot their house. But everybody else is expecting them to get up and start working. So if you can put them on a simulator that shows them what their house looks like from up on the crane, you immediately, once they've sat down on their first day, it doesn't feel like their first day because it's an environment they're so used to because they've seen it on the simulators.
I think I'd do the same thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I want to see. And I think, again, from the shipping background, you know what it's like when you have the kind of ship simulators. The first thing you want to do is make the weather as bad as possible. It's the same as that. You can see what it's like when it's really windy. And the chairs rock and things like that. So you can find out what it's like being up there. You might think you're quite happy working up there in the middle of the summer, but what's it like in the middle of winter and things like that?
Yeah.
I don't know whether looking at things that are coming up in the future, I have done a previous podcast about green fuels and how that's going to affect seafarers on ships. But obviously, ships come into harbour to refuel and whatever fuel that might be. Is there any impact as yet with the sort of decarbonisation in shipping coming to port?
I think there's a lot of different places where decarbonisation is coming. A lot of ports are using electric vehicles in their ports now, so that's one thing. I think the actual fuelling and how we deal with that is going to be, it's a chicken and egg thing of the ports are saying once the ships have decided what fuel they'll have, the ports will make that available where they can. But, when you're talking about new ships still being built in the way they're being built today and the ship's life being kind of 20 years, we're not talking about something that's going to change overnight in ports. So I think for new fuels, they've got time to wait and see how the trend develops. And I think a bit like the kind of LNG, they don't want to go too far in one if it's not picked up particularly well. So I think they want to, there's a bit of a waiting game to see, where their customers basically are going to go. And I think, ports have, they work with particular customers a lot, so they're going to just be keeping an eye on where they're going. I think one of the things that we are finding is an increasing area of concern is around electric vehicles and particularly lithium-ion batteries. And I think the evidence suggests that it's not any more likely that an electric will have a fire than any other type of vehicle, but that if there is a fire, it's going to be much more serious and much more difficult to deal with in an electric vehicle. And that has a number of implications for ports, for electric vehicles that ports are using for themselves, like the tugs and those sorts of things that tend to be moving towards battery. So that's an issue. You've got car passenger vessels where people are taking electric vehicles onto those vessels, but you've also got car carriers where they can be carrying a large number of electric vehicles at one time or storing a large number of electric vehicles in ports. And there's still a lot of question marks about what is the best way of dealing with those fires and the knock-on effects of those. And, some of the solutions that are being suggested at the moment don't always work. Things like fire blankets it's fine if you've got a car fire, but if you're talking about a port that's got a lot of electric vehicles stacked up next to each other, it's going to be difficult to cover all of those. And also, if you want to cover a car fire with a fire blanket, you need someone that's going to walk up to that fire and put the blanket over it. So that's one issue. There's a lot of fire services talking about dousing it with water until it stops. But where does all that water go to once it's put out that fire? Is it going into the sea? And therefore, a port's going to then have a whole pollution problem. So there's lots of questions. At the moment, it kind of feels like lots of questions and not enough answers. And Port Skills and Safety are hoping to put a seminar on towards the end of the year where we bring together a lot of those people in that conversation to say, we're all starting to understand what the risks are, and we haven't quite hit on what the solution is yet, but the best way to find the solution is to get together and systematically go through what the options are and kind of talk about them in that open and honest forum to say, what are the risks? How much of it is just about the kind of e-scooters where they're fitting dodgy batteries on them, and how much of it is, any kind of electric vehicle might have an inherent risk to it, and being honest about what those risks are. Because, like we said earlier, the more honest we are about the risks, the better position we'll be in to mitigate those risks. And that's ultimately what we all want, is to find a way to mitigate those risks. It's not about stopping anything. It's about just being aware of what the risks are so that we can work with them.
That sounds really interesting seminar. So do let us know when you've got a date and when it's happening, and we'll definitely promote that.
And kind of call out for people that have concerns around this area to get in touch with us, because we're trying to find. We found that a lot of ports are going to their local fire services, and they're kind of working with them. But we want to get a national conversation going about it, and also with manufacturers, because we find a lot of the time the manufacturers are missing from the conversation a bit, and we're having to deal with the outcomes rather than understanding what's going into these things to understand how we can deal with it better. So, anyone that deals with car manufacturers and deals with car carriers and is working with those fire services or has dealt with any kind of electric vehicle fires, lithium-ion batteries, then we'd love to hear from you.
And I think that's not only an issue for the future, I think that's an issue for the present as well, that you've touched on there about design and designers. I think some vessels, and certainly some elements of ports that I've seen, are not designed with people that really understand the maritime domain. And so as a result, they don't detect the nuance. I'll give you a simple example. Having a high-rise building next to a deep quayside, as I did. Really simple thing. The windows weren't designed to be cleaned by opening them up and standing inside the building. You want to get them cleaned because of all the salt spray, and yet every time you got a window cleaner near them, he's having to put a ladder up 2 meters away from a very deep quay edge. That hadn't been thought through. Something as simple as that.
Yeah, we hear a lot of those sort of things, of the cargoes that ports are having and the clearance that they need. It affects where they put it in the ports, and as ports are getting bigger and the ships are getting bigger and the cargoes are getting bigger, where everything goes and the effect that it makes, and everyone's got to live together. So, it's better for us to be, to be coming together and talking about it from the start, rather than, a bit like the lithium-ion battery thing, kind of only finding out these things are a problem once we start having problems.
Exactly.
If we can be involved in those conversations from the start, we can understand what the risks are and mitigate them. It's not, we're not trying to spoil anybody's fun. We're just trying to make things safer. And the more we can understand about it, the more safer we can make things.
We share many of those aims because the future is exciting with all the changes coming, but, mass automation, AI, novel fuels, but it does feel like quite an uncertain time. As we've touched on briefly, what are the different types of fuels? Will you get ports that only do one type, or will they try to offer two or three? And do they have the physical space to put two or three different fueling structures? If we're talking about automation and mass, autonomous shipping, do they require extra things within ports to enable them to navigate automatically and potentially give a remote operator some form of additional situational awareness? And of course, all the training that goes alongside with all these things as well. So no, I think it's really laudable what you do, and I really commend you for doing it.
Sometimes we give maritime a bit of a hard time of saying, it's quite a slow adopter and we move quite slowly, but ports change and maritime change and shipping has changed hugely in the last 10, 20, 50, 100 years. So we are used to adapting to change. I think sometimes we give ourselves a hard time and think that we're not. And it sometimes moves slowly, and particularly when it's something that's got to go through legislation, because you're looking at global legislation, it's naturally going to move slower. But we do adapt to new technologies. Ships are full of new technologies. I know when I started in shipping kind of 15 years ago, we were talking a lot about having Wi-Fi on ships and allowing seafarers to be connected. But that's not really a conversation we have to have anymore because it's been dealt with. And I think it's the same thing. It's just, if we can have the conversation, we can start looking at the answers. It's when we avoid those conversations that the problems start. And that's why collaboration is kind of PSS's founding principle of we need to come together and talk, and then we can get the answers.
Do you know, that's a really positive point to end on, I think.
Really positive. Although we do always give our guests one special last question, don't we, Adam?
You do, Julia.
So I do. Yeah, I do. But if there was one thing you could change that would make it safer in port safety, is there one thing you could name that you feel would make a difference?
Oh, if I got to only pick one, I think if I could pick two, I would say I still think we need to deal with diversity a little bit. I think we need to get more diversity in ports. And that doesn't just mean bringing people into maritime. It means making sure there's a safe environment for them to work in once they get here. And that's, again, it's not just about women. It's about getting more nationalities, particularly in the UK, getting UK ports to reflect the UK communities that those ports are often based in. But making sure that once those people come into work, that they've got a reason to stay and that they're not put off by hurdles that maritime being a bit slower to adopt hasn't quite caught up with world changing. So that would be one for a kind of what I would like to see changing in maritime. In ports specifically, I think the one thing that can make ports safer is that data sharing. So I would encourage everybody to give more information and share more. And I can't see any downsides to that. I can't see any negativity coming out of sharing more data. I think people's fears around sharing we should have dealt with by now, and I think we have dealt with by now. And the only way we can prove that is by trusting ourselves to do the best and not to use that information against anybody for any other reasons other than making ports safer.
I can see Adam really liking that answer a lot.
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, I'm biased, aren't I? Because we run an incident reporting service that collects data. So, yeah.
Yeah. But it is for the benefit of everyone, isn't it? Like, we may as well learn from others because that's a lot less painful than having the mistake yourself, isn't it?
Absolutely.
When you look at what's made other sectors safer, and I would include shipping in this and I would include oil and gas in this, is that there tends to have been a big incident that's got a lot of public focus and has had a public consultation come out of it, some sort of public inquiry. And that's resulted in a lot of legislation. And, if you look at kind of just, the Titanic, the Piper Alpha, those things have had big public consultations that have given a whole load of legislation that doesn't always fit actually within those industries because it's given by someone outside of it. But it has definitely made those sectors safer. And ports hasn't, touch wood, ever really had that one big incident. And for me, it's about saying, let's try to avoid having to have that. We know what makes ports safer. We don't need an external public consultation to kind of possibly come up with too many answers that won't work. Let's learn the lessons from those other incidents already and adapt them to ports so that we can avoid having to have that big issue and that big one incident that brings all the focus on safety in ports.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a positive message, I think. That's really been very interesting talking to you, Debbie. I always ring the bell now and we leave the bridge and we'll be going very safely, won't we, and disembarking into the port.
Wearing full PPE, I hope.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting talking to you, Debbie.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Fishing vessel Great Falls, Aberdeen Coast Guard, we are reading you out and clear.